Chapter 12. Sunday mid-afternoon. Just because Doreen couldn't let anybody down, didn't mean the answers would come. This was another case where she had to tread carefully. This was a recent case, well, okay, one from 10 years ago that could be related to this recent case. Still, that put the original event in the cold case category, but it wasn't like it was 20 or 30 years ago, where half the population of Kelowna didn't even know about it. Most likely, this case was still on everybody's mind. It was certainly still on Clarice. Once back home again, the doors locked, Doreen headed to the kitchen and her trusty teapot. She had only sat down for 5 minutes before Muggs jumped up on his back legs before her. She looked at him and frowned. "Did I not feed you?" She promptly fed them all, watching as they buried their faces in their food. Somehow she planned these walks for an hour, but they often became 2. She should get a pedometer to track her footsteps. She imagined it would surprise her just how many thousands she'd taken in a day, and that could account for the fact that she still hadn't put on any of the weight she'd lost after separating from her husband. Her husband would approve of this look. He had always preferred the bony hips and the thin shoulder blades and collarbones, like cover models. Doreen was actually putting on some muscle with her gardening work. When she thought about how she had manhandled a lot of the tools and done the gardening at Penny's place, she figured gaining muscle was a lot better than being skinny. Just the thought of Penny brought a sense of disquiet to Doreen. She'd really liked the woman. But when you find out all the secrets somebody is working hard to keep hidden, you learn a lot about the person behind it all. Doreen was sorry she hadn't met George, who'd done something for his wife to keep her safe, and had held that secret deep inside until it was like a poison, fearing everything bad that happened since then had been his fault. Doreen didn't have any right or wrong answers on fate or karma or good versus evil, yet she figured a lot of the evil came in the two-legged form. As she sat quietly musing away, surprisingly tired, Muggs came to her and jumped up again on his back legs. She reached down and scratched his long ears. "What's the matter, boy?" He woofed a couple times, and then walked back to the living room and turned to look at her. She frowned but got up and followed him. Left behind, Thaddeus squawked and said, "Wait, wait, wait," and he dashed off the table to land on the floor with a hard thump and proceeded to waddle behind them. Goliath wouldn't be left alone either, and sauntered forward. Doreen stood in the living room and stared at Muggs. "What's the matter?" He barked several times. She frowned and then realized with horror that he stood atop the hidey hole entrance. She walked over to him and asked, "Really? Are you sure?" She kept her voice at a whisper. He barked again and again. She didn't know what to do now. If somebody was down there, they could have gotten in this way or from the garage, most likely from the garage, as coming in through the main doorways would have set off the alarms. But once the intruder was down there, he could come up through here quite easily and then, what? She glanced around at the antiques on the mantel and all around the property, and realized she had almost no inventory of everything left here after Scott's moving men had packed up things. But it didn't take long to note a couple of items collected to one end of the mantel. But was that because Scott had set a few items aside for Agatha to look at? Or to go to Christie's? Or had the movers shifted things around so they didn't fall off and break with their movements? Swearing to herself, she backed up and walked through the kitchen, into the garage, where the double doors led down to the basement while dialing Mac. While passing through the garage, she picked up a pitchfork she'd gotten from Penny's and stood at the double doors, checking them out. There was no way to prop anything underneath those handles. They were lever tight, and she wasn't sure she'd jam anything in there that would stop the intruder from opening these doors. When Mac answered the phone, she asked, "Are you busy?" "Don't have to be." "Why?" "Because I think I have an intruder again." He swore softly. "Don't go after him," he barked out as a warning. "Then you better get here fast," she said in a mutinous tone. "Because if he's after my antiques, you know what I'll do to him." I'm coming. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Hold your horses. I will, she said, but I'm not sure I can watch both entrances. Just hold on, Mac said in alarm. She heard his vehicle start up and grinned at that. She wondered how to check the front entrance and this one, to make sure nobody was at either spot. She walked back and forth from one to the other but, so far, saw no sign of anyone. Only Muggs wouldn't stop barking a warning bark. You keep warning him, she said, her voice rising. I don't know who's down there, but that somebody should be prepared to take a pitchfork in the abdomen. She wasn't usually so feisty and had never been bloodthirsty, but something about people trying to take what wasn't theirs got her blood going. She made another trip, heading back inside to check on the trapdoor in the living room floor. It was hard for one person, her, to keep an eye on both of the exits, so she pulled the 2 heavy pot chairs over the wooden trapdoor, hoping she'd at least hear if somebody tried to push open that hatch. Oh my God. As a complete afterthought, she grabbed one of the kitchen table chairs and jammed it under the doorknob to the single-door basement access also from the living room. Then she raced back to the double doors in the garage, waiting for somebody to exit that way. Of course she hadn't opened either door and checked the basement for her intruder. Mac would have a heyday if she did. Some things he just wouldn't tolerate, but if he didn't know about it. Still, she didn't know if her intruder was one person or 2 people. Or more. She walked over to the big exterior garage door, unlocked it, and pulled the huge door up, amazed at the kind of lift swing system that allowed her to manually lift the heavy door so easily. She had no idea such a thing was possible before. The garage doors in her previous home had looked heavy and awkward, and completely impossible to move. She'd only had ones with remotes, yet she didn't even remember having that. Usually the doors were opened for her and closed after she was inside by somebody else. She hadn't even had to bother with remotes at her own home. She shook her head as she realized just how completely useless she'd been before, and how different her life was now. She stared down at her fingers and her fingernails, wincing. Her hands were scraped, the nails rough and ragged, and they were certainly not the long pointed manicured nails she used to sport. They were also stained almost a light brown, as if she were a smoker. She rubbed her fingertips together, wondering where that discoloration had come from. It was hard to imagine which chemicals would do that, but nicotine was the worst. Or iodine. And she certainly hadn't had her hands close to either of those. Still, something in the local soil was reacting to her nails. Oh well, such was her new improved life. She went back inside to check on the living room again, saw the pot chairs were still there and the kitchen chair still propped where she had left it, and came back out to the garage. That was where she was when Mac drove up. Muggs raced toward Mac as he hopped out, took one look at her, his gaze going to the pitchfork in her hand, and he slowly, carefully let out a hard breath. He strode forward and gently removed the pitchfork from her hand and hung it back up on the wall. Crouching down to greet an ecstatic Muggs, he turned to glare at her. She motioned at the double doors leading downstairs and in a low voice said, "We went for a walk and came back. All the security was set. I sat down to have a cup of tea. Muggs here was kind of bugging me. I didn't understand what he wanted, so I fed him, and then, when he was done, he did the same thing again, and he led me back to the living room." She walked him inside, where she'd put the pot chairs over the hatch, and pointed to the kitchen chair at the single basement door too. "When I figured they didn't have to come in through the alarms, and they could have come in through the garage, because I don't have security everywhere." Mac frowned, nodded, and walked back out to the double doors in the garage. With her staying at the top at his instruction, he slipped down the stairs and turned on the lights. She had to hold Muggs back. Mac stopped at the bottom step and took a long look, but he saw nothing. He turned to look up at her, and she pointed to the small room off to the side, the root cellar area. He nodded and tiptoed forward, so he could look around the corner. Mac disappeared from view while she watched and then listened. She heard a shout, various sounds followed by a kerfuffle, and no way she could just wait here. What if he needed her help? She snatched the pitchfork off the wall again. With Muggs barking and urging her on, she raced down the stairs. As she came around the corner into the cold room section of the basement, she found Mac with a man on the dirt floor pinned under his knee. She flicked on the light and smiled. "You got him," she cried out in delight. Mac nodded, looked at her and groaned. "Put that pitchfork back," he ordered. "And get Muggs to quiet down." She lifted the pitchfork ever so slightly in defiance. "He was breaking into my house," she snapped. "If you weren't here, you know I would have taken my pitchfork to him." She squatted and placed a calming hand on Muggs. Mac lifted the guy's head and turned it over so he could see Doreen with her pitchfork. "This is what you would have come up against," he said, "and that's the easy part." The kid just groaned. Mac lifted him up so he stood on his feet but had his arms pinned behind his back. Doreen looked at her intruder and cried out, "I don't even know who you are. What are you doing in my house?" He just stared at her and frowned. "You're working with them, aren't you?" she snapped. "You're working with Darth." The kid looked surprised when she brought up the name. He frowned and then shrugged. "He said he had left some stuff here, and you were trying to steal it from him." She snorted at that. "He's in jail because he broke into my house and stole things from me," she stated. "And when did you have a chance to talk with him?" The guy winced. She crossed her arms, planting the pitchfork in the soft ground first. "Seriously? You were in jail when you talked to him? Well, that figures, doesn't it? Another lowlife." "Hey, that's not fair," he snapped. "I was just going out to party and got a little too drunk." "Yeah, sure. And just because of that, you were really happy to turn around and pick up his dirty deed and carry it on, huh?" "I needed the money," he whined. "How would he pay you?" she asked. "He's in prison." He just shrugged and stayed quiet. She looked at Mac. "Now what?" "Now I have more paperwork again." "Like you don't cause me enough paperwork," he growled. "It's not my fault this time." "Besides, it is what it is," she snapped, then returned her gaze to her intruder. "How did you get into my house?" "The outside door to the garage," he said. "It's not locked." "No," she said. "I was struggling with that earlier. I normally keep a chair propped underneath it." "Sure, but when I gave the door a good shake, the chair fell to the side." "Figures," she snapped. She stared at Mac. He nodded. "I'll be glad when the antiques guy comes back to take that stuff." "But that doesn't mean I'm in the clear," she said, "as I still have all the little stuff to deal with." "You'll need to do something about that really fast," he said, "because obviously the word is out that your house is full of valuables." "Drat," she said. She ran her fingers through her hair and sighed. "I need to do something. Maybe you can help me completely close that one garage door. Nail it shut." "I don't know," she said. She straightened, looked in the direction of the door, and said, "Maybe I'll go look at that right now." She walked back toward the door, then stopped. "Do you need help with him? Or are you okay to take him to the station?" "I got this," Max said as he pulled a pair of handcuffs from his back pocket, and while she watched, he hooked the guy's wrists together. "I've patted him down. He doesn't have anything on him. Probably making a pile to take out later." She grinned at her intruder. "See? Crime doesn't pay. And you're going to jail again. That's what you deserve," she said triumphantly. "How dare you come into some poor woman's house and steal from her?" "Hey," the guy said, "I don't have anything on me." "Have you tried getting a real job?" she asked in a snide voice, holding Muggs close. "No," he snapped. "Have you?" She grinned and said, "I already work. Part-time, but at least I do." And she turned and walked away. She wouldn't tell him that she was working in Mac's mother's garden. Her intruder didn't have to know that detail. Back up in the garage, she navigated around the furniture and walked over to the door in question. Sure enough, the chair had fallen to the side. Frowning, she picked it up, opened the door, closed it a couple times, and wondered what she was supposed to do to secure this door. It wasn't like she had much in the way of spare wood to put over it and to nail it closed. And if she did the same on the outside, what would stop anybody from pulling the boards off there too? The door opened outward, and of course, lovely Hornby had shaved it down so it was easy to open. Too easy to open. She studied the bottom, wondering if she could jam something underneath to stop it from opening, but it would have to be cleverly concealed to stop anybody else from getting in. She made her way back into the kitchen and grabbed a cardboard box, and with her trusty scissors, headed back out to the garage. She cut off one flap from the box and folded it, and using a crowbar, jammed it really tightly underneath her unsecured door, so it was almost impossible to see. When Mac came up with his prisoner, she walked over and said, "Do you want to try opening that door for me?" He shoved the thief into a kitchen chair and told him to sit. With Doreen standing guard with her trusty pitchfork, Mac tried the door. He looked back at her and raised an eyebrow. She beamed at him. "Now I think we might be safe." He shrugged and said, "Well, it's good. Could put a couple spikes through here too, but it's not likely the best idea. It'll crack the core of the door. This is pretty tight." He motioned at his prisoner to get up and said to Doreen, his voice raspy, "We'll talk about how you handled this later." She just beamed at him. "Whenever." She walked both of them to Mac's car as he seatbelted the guy into the back seat. She stood there, frowning at Mac. "I don't think you should take him alone." "He's not going anywhere," Mac said. "I'll lock him in. We have a cage behind my seat. I'll be fine." But he grinned at her. "Nice to know you care." Then he remembered something and pulled a roll of small bills from his pocket. "Before I forget again, here's your gardening money." "Thanks." Happily she took it and stuffed it in her pocket, but then her frown returned as she looked at the punk kid in the back seat, smirking at her. "I don't like his attitude," she announced. The punk's smile fell away. She felt better after that. Then the punk glared at her and said, "I don't like your attitude either," mimicking her voice. Again she just glared at him and watched as the two left. Muggs lay at her feet, seemingly content.